Hello, my name is James Arroyo, and welcome to Chapter 4, Developing the Group Climate. We've discussed up to this point how groups form, what are groups, but now we're going to be talking about how groups feel, and this is most exemplified through the group climate. So let's jump right in. So, what is group climate? Group climate is the emotional atmosphere, the enveloping tone that is created by the way we communicate in groups. There's positive group climate, which makes people feel valued, supported, and treated well by the group, whereas negative climate, people don't feel valued, supported, or even respected. So, which ones do we feel that we've been a part of? Probably the negative ones, because as we've discussed in classes, that we've come into this class with some of these negative attitudes. So this is in big part due to our negativity bias. Negativity bias is the strong tendency to be influenced by more heavily by negative than positive information. And this is built into the human brain. The thing is that it is evolutionarily advantageous for us to think negatively, that scary thing in the bush is something that's going to get us, versus, oh, that thing in the bush is probably totally fine. It might be, berries. Of course we don't think that way, because it is much easier for us to survive back then to imagine that it is automatically negative. However, it's not so great now. This can be especially strong in job interviews, because if this person is great with every single question and is just unflappable, and then makes one small mistake, then people may rely more heavily on that information than all of the other information that has been presented up to that point. Sometimes the negative information can outweigh the positive. Should outweigh the positive. For example, if someone is, kind and funny and smart and attractive, but also murders people, that probably should outweigh all of those positives. And by presenting an abundance of but overall, there are many benefits of positive communication. So, how do we overcome it? By presenting an abundance of positive information. This can contradict a single bad act and overcome negativity bias, unless that bad act is egregious, like murder or whatever, or eating pineapple on pizza. That is one bad act that I'm sure that no one can get around. So, should we be positive all the time? Just, happy-go-lucky? Of course not. First of all, we shouldn't, and it's not human to be positive all the time. But there are general ratios, and this is to be taken, as a guide, not as prescribe, but 3 to 1 is a good way to is a tipping point to overcome that negativity bias. That when we communicate, 3 positives to every 1 negative thing, then that's better. It overcomes that negativity bias. That being said, for optimum results, we should be communicating positively 5 positive things for every 1 negative. Disproportionate emphasis on positivity isn't required to uh, is required to combat negativity bias. It is required because we think negatively and we assume negatively that we have to overcome it with disproportionate positivity. So think positive. A key element of establishing a positive group climate is offering recognition and praise, not to mention that this must be authentic. So, praise and recognize and appreciate more than we act negatively. So this leads to competition and cooperation. Small groups should not view cooperation as always a good and competitive as always a bad. Sometimes competitive competition is called for, sometimes cooperation is called for. But we have to find those times and act in positive ways in all of these experiences. So there are four terms that need definition: competition, cooperation, individual achievement, and then we are going to be adding the term of hypercompetitiveness. Let's dive right in. We start with competition. Competition is mutually exclusive goal attainment process, meaning that I have to win. I have to. If I win, then others have to lose. It's the success of many. Success of me at the expense of others, and that's something that just has to happen in the world. Guess what? There are no two uh, football teams that win the uh, win the Super Bowl. There's not two hockey teams that win the Stanley Cup. Not to mention, it's not two people who get the one job if there is just one job opening. There are more people that are turned away from jobs than will ever get jobs. So there is some competition at play here, but we want to be sure that we're doing it in positive ways, as we will later discuss. Also, cooperation is mutually inclusive goal attainment. This is a common goal is achieved by members working together, not against each other. Cooperation is a process of how we get to our goal, not the outcome itself. That we try to work together to achieve goals that we would like. Then we have individual achievement, and this is going alone, the attainment of personal goals without having to defeat another person. An example of this could be, you know, singing. That my succeeding in singing doesn't and of making an emotional effect on people isn't going to detriment other people's ability to do the same thing. However, sometimes people feel that they are competing against themselves, and but it is just one of those things that it is if you're competing with yourself and it's mutually exclusive goal attainment, then you are also losing. So that's kind of weird. It doesn't really make sense. So for conceptual clarity, it is just important to understand the difference between competition and individual achievement, because we are not competing with ourselves. We are trying to achieve for ourselves. And then lastly, we have hypercompetitiveness. And this is the winning is everything attitude, an excessive emphasis on defeating others to achieve one's own goals. And this is where competition can get toxic. Hypercompetitiveness, not competitiveness, is that it poses the greatest challenge when establishing positive group climates of trust, openness, directness, supportiveness, and accomplishment. A big reason for that is because when we have these situations where we do, when there is this hyper competitive attitude, then it disconfirms every other person. It doesn't show respect for any other person. It doesn't support any other person, because at that point it is not about them at all. They could be uh, statues for all I care. It's about me winning. And it's that sort of disregard that shuts people down, makes them defensive, and ends up creating hyper competitive actions from the other person as well, and defensive responses. It should not be our goal to get rid of competition. Competition is not bad. And in fact, competition, when done in certain ways, can even make it be more constructive than destructive. So we should develop constructive competition. Constructive competition occurs when rivalry produces positive, enjoyable experiences and generates increased effort to achieve goals without jeopardizing positive interpersonal relationships. I remember back in the day when dinosaurs roamed the earth and I was running. And I had a friend named Avinash Kumar, and we were running. We were having a great time, and we were both on the same cross country team. And he would win every single race, and I was like, "Oh no, I'm this close to beating you." And we had this sort of constructive competition where we would work together to try to beat each other. But in the same way, we were also having a good time, enjoying the positive interpersonal relationship, and pushing ourselves to be better. How do we turn hyper-competitiveness to positive, constructive, and constructive competition? Well, there's a few ways. First, when winning is de-emphasized. Winning should not be the primary goal. And that's weird to think about in regards to competition. But when we think of that, uh, when we focus more on the process than on the outcome, that can cause a lot of benefits. Not just a lack of hyper competitiveness, but it can even make us more likely to persist when we do inevitably have those failures. But, and even to that point, John Wooden, the UCLA basketball coach who won like 10 NCAA championships in his last 12 years coaching, he did not mention winning to his team once. It was all about the skills that they were developing. It was all about offense and defense. It was never about, we are going to win this game. Also, when opponents are equally matched, allowing all participants to have a reasonable chance to win. I don't know about you, but whenever I play video games, my friends do not stand a chance. And as a result, what ends up happening is hyper competitiveness from them and from me. And as a result, if there is no chance of the other person winning or evenly matched or even having a reasonable chance to win, at that point, what's the point for the other person? Just to continue to lose? And that was actually very much showed when we started playing games that there were handicaps so that it would actually be more balanced. When there are clear, specific rules that ensure fairness, a lot of times in big organizations, there is competitive backstabbing. It's not very common, but it can sometimes happen. And when there are not clear rules and punishments for those who do break rules, then there can be fairness. These three are the holy trinity. That if one is not there, then the rest of them fall apart as well. A good example of this is that if we are not evenly matched, but winning's de-emphasized and there are specific rules, I'm still gonna think that I'm a loser, so I don't want that, and there would be constructive competition again, or destructive, hyper competitiveness. I meant. Culture plays into hyper competitiveness, and guess what? USA, we are a hyper competitive culture. Incredibly so. I mean, I was just talking about how singing, is not really competitive. It's more about individual achievement. Yeah, we made that into a competition. So it is something that is a ingrained cultural identifier of America that we are very hyper competitive, but there is an abundance of cooperation that does occur. But collectivistic cultures tend to be far less competitive than American culture. Next, we move on to cooperative group climates and how we can try to cultivate positivity. Developing a positive group climate, however, is more likely uh, it does happen more when there is a cooperation, when there's cooperation is cultivated. Groups that perform at high levels typically enjoy positive group climates. Groups that perform poorly tend to flounder in dissension and blame. So, in general, positive group climates help. Negative group climates tend to breed more negativity. So we want to be sure that we are cultivating these. Social relationships also thrive in this cooperative environment, and attempting to achieve excellence and trying to beat others are completely different goals. And that when we do have this competitive mindset where it is me trying to beat you, as we've said, it communicates that you don't matter. It's all about me, and that is a very negative approach. So, communication and group climate. There's defensive and supportive communication, and this is how we shape these positive and negative communication climates in these groups. Defensive, we have defense provoking response and supportive communication. But let's first define defensiveness. Defensiveness is a reaction to a perceived attack on our self-concept and self-esteem. So when it doesn't matter if it's actually happening, if we perceive that there's an attack on our self-concept and self-esteem, at that point, then we get defensive. And we act defensively by attacking the other person, and we know all of the behaviors that come from that. Defensive communication patterns heighten negativity. Conversely, supportive communication patterns highlight positivity. So that is the key to getting a more positive communication climate in our groups. So there are many ways to remove destructive, um, defense provoking communication and replacing it with supportive communication. First, the destructive criticism, supportive description, destructive control, supportive problem orientation, destructive manipulation versus assertiveness, indifference versus empathy, superiority versus equality, certainty versus provisionalism, and incivility versus civility. Let's jump right in. First, we have criticism versus description, that we criticize someone instead of just describing the behavior that they did. So we are quick to criticize each other in American society due to our hyper-competitiveness. And we are ready to defend ourselves in self-justification even when it's not even needed or called for. So how we deliver the message is critical, because if we do it in defense-provoking ways, then we're going to get a defensive response. Versus if we do it in a more supportive way, then we will get a completely different response. In essence, we can say the exact same concern in a slightly different way and get a wildly different result. So, how do we describe? First, by making suggestions, but avoiding blame. A good way of doing this is by doing I statements instead of you statements. You is an automatic blame of you did this, you did that, you were this, you were that. Versus I noticed this, I felt that. By that point, you are taking responsibility for your own perspective of it, and you're suggesting that something change versus you did this. Also, describe behaviors, not perceived character flaws. If you perceive someone is lazy and you say you are lazy, then that isn't really going to solve anything, because you are in essence saying that they are lazy, and even if they are, that's fine, but they can't change that. Instead, focus on the behavior because behavior can always change. So instead of saying you're lazy, what are some of the things that they can change? What are the things that I'm looking at? Hey, uh, I would really appreciate uh, if you clean the dishes in a somewhat timely manner. Or maybe uh, I noticed that the trash hasn't been taken out in a while. Is it okay if you take it out this time? In those sorts of ways, you're just describing the behavior and not making it an automatic character attack, which will absolutely attack the person's self-concept and self-esteem. Also, make your description specific, not vague. Instead of, you know, you were um, you were really angry back there. Instead, what about the situation was angry? So focus in specific behaviors. Also, don't wait to praise someone until something goes wrong. At that point, then do the criticism sandwich of praise, criticize, praise. There is some research to support the efficacy of both ways of the criticism sandwich, but overall, it's not a good way of going about feedback because first of all, the criticism can get lost. And then also, the person then may think of, oh, there's a positive, but there's going to be a but here soon. And as a result, lose sight of that positive as well. And then also eliminate editorial comments from your descriptive statements. Next, we move on to control versus problem orientation. Control is trying to control the situation, control the other person, versus problem orientation is both of us solving the problem. Think of this with teachers. The teacher that is, hey, do this right. Why are you not doing this right? Here's the things you have to do, or I will fail you. That is control orientation. It's issuing orders and demanding obedience, especially when no input was sought from group members who were told what to do. That is controlling communication. Versus problem orientation, which is focusing on here's the problem that I'm having with this relationship. How are we both going to address this? Psychological reactance is the more someone tries to control us by telling us what to do, the more we are inclined to resist such efforts or even to do the opposite. This is almost certainly what has happened at our teenage years. This psychological reactance of someone saying, no, you shouldn't do that. And then, well, now I want to do it more. So we want to be sure that we are understanding this and then trying to combat it, but in the same way as communicators trying to develop supportive communication climates, not trying to control the other person, allowing them the ability to make choices, but by focusing on the problem and then allowing us to solve that problem. With control, it's like you are more or less the problem versus a problem orientation, we're kicking the ball around together. Telling someone they can't do something, and then typically it's what they want to do most. You can prevent psychological reactance from emerging when the orientation is on the problem and how best to solve it, not how best to control the other person's behavior. Next, we have manipulation versus assertiveness. We do not like to feel manipulated, so when we start to feel manipulated, then there is an automatic attack back. when we hidden agendas, personal goals of group members that are not revealed openly, that can interfere with group accomplishment, can create a defensive atmosphere. So if someone perceives that the other person has a hidden agenda, something that they want to achieve, that the other people feel like is not within the group goal, and that uh, is hidden from the rest of the group, then that can cause a very defensive atmosphere of like, well, if they're going for this goal, are we going to be a part of that goal? What's going on? And that can cause a lot of uncertainty, and uncertainty is a very uncomfortable state, which then can cause more defensiveness. Also, we have indifference versus empathy. Oh, sorry. So, with manipulate, sorry, how do we remove this? By being assertive with what we want, and being assertive that we want to know what people want. So it's just about being assertive and sharing what you want, and not having any hidden agendas. Also, we have indifference versus empathy. I'm always saying apathy. Em- uh, Indifference damages the interpersonal relationship much more than outright rejection. Indifference is not caring about the other person or anything like that. So we want to be sure that we are removing this, because when I show that I am indifferent to your concern, let's say that maybe we're having a group meeting, and you know my someone a group member's mom is at the hospital. At that point, if someone acts in an indifferent way, well, no, you said that you would be here, therefore you have to be here. That's going to cause a big problem to the other person, to their self-concept, to their self-esteem, because in essence you're saying, you're being ridiculous, do this. So instead, we want to act with empathy. Empathy is the capacity to share what someone else is thinking and feeling. It requires that we try to see from the other person's perspective. There is a big difference between sympathy and empathy. Sympathy is very much this sort of indifference of, oh, I'm so sorry, but still fairly indifferent, versus empathy, which is really showing that you understand the other person and connecting with them. A big part of where indifference is seen, or at least for me, is within organizational frameworks, that this sort of, red tape, these rules that have to be followed, indifferent of the situation. The people who at 11:59 and 59 seconds, or I don't know how, maybe 12:01, McDonald's has stopped serving breakfast, but I want breakfast. I mean, it's right there, can I please have it? No, sorry. This sort of indifference, or at least a lack of even attempting to understand, can cause a defensive response in some. Then we have superiority versus equality. Superiority tends to be from the group leader, and that can cause some defensiveness in others, and therefore diminish this group climate. Group leaders who exhibit superiority to the group members undermine their credibility and influence. We should give everyone an equal opportunity to succeed and exhibit what and sorry and exhibit whatever potential they do possess. That instead of treating yourself like the king of the group, I mean, and this can even come from any person in the class, in the group, that we shouldn't try to act above other people, because at that point then you are in essence saying that I am better than these other people, and therefore that's putting yourself above them, and someone can feel very defensive about that, and it's very easy to see that someone could feel that their self-concept is being attacked. So how do we combat this? There are many ways, just by acting, like we're all equal, allowing other people to contribute. But even self-deprecating humor could be a good way to find this balance, but obviously within the balance. You don't want to just self-deprecate or else you'll too much, or else you'll end up losing credibility. We also have certainty versus provisionalism. Certainty are using words like never, always, it's impossible, you can't, you won't. That is focusing in specific things. You cannot do this, you should not do this, things like that. And that's not good, because at that point you are basically saying that outside of what you think, you can't do this. This is never going to work. It's always like this. That is impossible. That outside of what they think, my ideas are right, yours are wrong. So it's easy to understand that that would be create some defensiveness. So instead, we should engage in provisionalism. Means you qualify statements and avoid absolutes like you never, you always. In fact, you never, you always end up becoming automatic character attacks, and certain character attacks at that. So instead, we should use qualifying terms. Possibly, probably, perhaps, occasionally. This may be the right course of action. This might work. Sometimes I feel like instead of this is how you make me feel. You always make me feel this way. And in so doing, we understand that things are not always the same, and that we allow for more support and more contribution from others. Then we have incivility versus civility. Incivility is commonplace acts of rudeness and disrespect that most groups do end up doing. But we want to instead we want to be engaging with civility, treating people with respect, both verbally and non-verbally as well, by allowing people in. For example, one thing that is an easy way to do this is to open the door for people. That is a small civil thing that can allow for the group communication climate to be a little bit more positive. But again, uh, but yeah. Also, this can help engage in a reciprocal pattern that when I act civil, then other people act civil towards me. And then that creates a positive cycle. The challenge in any group is to maintain this positive reciprocal pattern of support and to break the cycle of negative reciprocal patterns of defensiveness, that instead of um, and those negative cycles tend to be a lot harder to break, because it's easy for me to act negative because I have a negativity bias. But it's harder for me that once I start seeing negative, to then try to break that and get away from my emotions and to try to be more positive, even though it may be in my mind that they don't deserve it. So these are many ways to make defensive climates and negative climates more supportive. Next, we talk about listening. Listening helps us enhance positivity. Listening is effectively one of the most critical communication skills group members can exhibit. So we should strive to do it. Why? Why is listening so why does it allow us to enhance positivity so much? Well, if we listen, we are showing in a very real sense that their opinion matters, their voice matters. And if I am listening to them, it is showing that I care and want to know what they have to say. And that is incredibly confirming. That is incredibly supportive. So, when people may be on phones texting while someone else is talking, even though I do not mean to communicate that I'm not listening, in fact, I might still be listening. The listening response, the response that I'm giving is that I am not, and as a result, that can cause a defensive response that the person feels the opposite, that their voice doesn't matter, that you don't care about what they have to say. Active listening is focused listening. It is not that hard to actively listen. It really isn't. When that we can listen actively, we just have to focus on it. And it's easy at minute 5, at minute 10, at minute 15, but at 30 minutes in, 34 minutes and 44 seconds in, that's where things start getting challenging. So we have to be sure that we're flexing these muscles and trying to improve, because it can really improve the group communication climate when we know that people are listening to us. And a big way to do this, and another big way with, so listening on its own is remarkable. But we also have to try to avoid a shift response and instead add in a support response. A shift response is a listener's attempt to shift the focus to attention of attention from others to oneself by changing the topic of discussion. Whereas a support response is the listener's attempt to focus attention on the other person, not on oneself. So, for example, if someone says, you know what, I'm really having a hard time uh, understanding James's lectures. They are just so confusing. Then someone else would say, someone else may shift response with, oh yeah, but it's not so much that, it's more just, his glasses, they have a weird tint, and as a result I hate those too. Versus a more supportive response of like, you know what, yeah, I guess that I can see that being frustrating. Why do you what is so what's why is it so hard to understand his lectures? And in so doing, now it's trying to probe, trying to get more information instead of shifting it to what I think. So, in other words, you already know what you know. So, why is that my purpose? That's not my purpose. The shift response is focusing on me, but I already know what I know. Instead, by focusing on the other person, of like, hey, well, I want to find out what you know now, that can improve the entire group. A shift response can easily provoke other shift response from other group members in a hyper competitive battle for attention. That, I'm talking about my thing and I'm talking about my thing, and then they're like, oh, yeah, well, let me talk about my thing now that's completely different and changing the topic. Oh, okay, now it's my turn to take the topic. Now it's my turn to take the topic. Instead of, let's talk about this topic for a while. Now it's going to gradually move to a different topic. Wow, okay, now we're talking about this topic. Competent communicators emphasize support responses and use shift responses very infrequently. There is also competitive interrupting. Listeners who use shift responses usually observe uh, the one speaker at a time rule of conversation, so that they will wait until the other person is actually finished and then try to shift response, whereas competitive interrupters may not. Instead, they would then jump in. Hey, can I stop you for a minute? Can I let you know that Beyonce, so on and so forth? I don't remember the entire thing that he said, but not all interrupting is competitive, but when it is to focus on now myself, then that's bad. Also to keep in, and I mean, sometimes interrupting is called for. For example, if someone was just, talking about something that was very off topic and kept on going for a very long time, then yeah, maybe it might be a good idea to interrupt. Hey, can I stop? Can I stop you right there? I feel like we should really get back on the task. Easy and not defense provoking. Versus and competitive interrupting begets more competitive interrupting. It is a cycle that can continue and start to form into a norm, which can then cause a very negative group communication climate. And lastly, we have ambushing. This listening just so that I can pounce on what the speaker has made. I have information, and now, okay, now I'm waiting. Now I'm waiting. Oh, they're still talking. Okay. Oh, yeah, well, how about this? Well, you said that, and now here, let me talk about this. So we want to be sure that we're avoiding this because this, again, can cause this negative communication climate. So how do we avoid this? By probing, seeking additional information from the speaker by asking questions. Because instead of assuming, okay, this is what you meant by this, and now I'm going to attack it, instead, it's like, here's what did you mean by this? You can use clarifying questions. Is this what you meant? Versus exploratory questions, exploring more of what they have to say, or even encouraging questions of, oh yeah, uh, well, just trying to encourage them to continue speaking. Also, there's paraphrasing. And this can be very useful as well. A concise response of what the speaker to the speaker, which states the essence of what the other person has said in their own words, shows that you've understood, or at least gives what you think they said. And then they have the ability to say, yes, that's what I said, which is therefore confirming, means because then you're listening to them. Or they say, no, that's not exactly what I meant. Then I'm like, oh, okay, then what did you mean? So all of these working together can help us improve our group communication climate, and because of that, that can build these things in others, and therefore overall lead to much better groups in the future. That concludes chapter 4. Have a great rest of your day. I will see you next time.